All right, I think we've reached a threshold, so we can begin. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Cliona Raleigh, and I'm the President and CEO of ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization, and it's the leading source of information on global conflict. I will be moderating today's session, and today's discussion, of course, will feature two of prominent commentators on the Sahel, and it will be about the Islamic State in the Sahel and its aims for regional expansion. That's, of course, a very important topic across Africa as a whole, but in particular, the embeddedness in the Sahel. So we are joined today by the author of this excellent report, Henny Nsimba, and he is our, of course, senior analyst for the Sahel region. He also leads the conflict data collection and analysis for the Sahel within ACLED. He is the director of MENAstream, which is a research and risk consultancy that provides intelligence analysis and tailored services. His expertise centers around insurgencies and their various dimensions and non-state actors in Sahelian states. And he will walk us through his presentation shortly, which is both extremely insightful and also very clear. We also have the pleasure of hosting Ivan Gachawa. Ivan is an independent researcher in independent and international conflict analysis. He has formerly occupied academic positions in Kent, Yale, and Oxford universities. He has been studying the dynamics of irregular armed groups in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Niger since about 2004. Since 2007, Ivan has been studying the Tuareg reoccurring rebellions in Niger and Mali and the rise of jihadism in the Sahel. So welcome, Ivan, and we are delighted to have you today, especially, of course, in light of some recent activity within Bamako, which I'm sure we will end up discussing. So just so everybody knows the lay of the land, after a presentation from Henny and remarks from Ivan, you will then have the opportunity to ask questions. I will moderate the questions during this live Q&A, and feel free to pop your question into the Q&A function throughout the event. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Henny. Thank you, Henny.
First of all, I would like to thank everyone who has contributed to this report and organizing today's event. And of course, everyone in the audience who has taken the time to tune in and join us today. So as you might know, following the successive military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the region that we refer to as the Central Sahel has undergone a significant geopolitical transition. And new military regimes have turned away from traditional partners or Western partners, including France, US, and other countries, and instead shifted partnerships toward Russia and paramilitary groups, including the Wagner Group, which more recently often is referred to as the Africa Corps. And it is in this new geopolitical landscape and security context that we, in our latest report, situate one of the most violent and active armed groups in the broader conflict of the region. The report is grounded in ACLED data, qualitative research, and extensive monitoring. And it takes its departure with the withdrawal of the French military from Mali, which created a security vacuum that the group subject of this report, the Islamic State Sahel province, or IS Sahel, has exploited to restructure itself, launch large-scale offensives, also gaining the status of a separate province within the organizational structure of the global Islamic State militant organization. It has expanded geographically, but also shifted away from the use of mass violence that really kind of characterized the group in the earlier years of its existence. And it has also gained territorial control in some geographic areas where it is now implementing its own self-styled jihadist governance. And on the visual that you can see, you will have two parallel timelines listing organizational development and military activities, including key events, military campaigns since its formation as the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, or ISGS, to become, for roughly 3 years, integrated as a distinct wing or subgroup of the Islamic State West Africa province, or ISWAP, which is based in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. But during this time, it was sort of an umbrella for West Africa during the time under ISWAP. But the focus of this report is the transformation into a standalone province that took place in March 2022. And we can move on to the next slide. So one of the main contributions of this report, I believe, is to highlight the underexplored aspects of IS Sahel's organizational structure, but also how it is militarily organized through a set of military zones. This restructuring is a process that has been ongoing ever since the French military Operation Barkhane eliminated much of the group's historical leadership. And with the French forces' withdrawal, the group found opportunity to not only reorganize, but also to stage a major offensive and take control of most of the Menaka region, except for the regional capital of Menaka, along some areas in the neighboring Gao region. And since the death of Adnan Abu Walid al-Sahrawi in August 2021, who is IS Sahel's founding leader, at the time it was Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, but also along with the other senior cadres, the group has engaged in restructuring efforts, or in other words, there was already a bench of replacements available of fighters that have been groomed for years after gaining experience on the battlefield to replace both foreign and local leaders. But it's really under the leadership of the current emir or wali, which translates to either leader or governor, Abul Bara al-Sahrawi, is the organizational framework of the group that has become much more centralized and bureaucratic. And low bureaucracy was really something that characterized insurgent groups in the region prior, but they have also evolved strategically and developed over time. But now the structure includes much more kind of specialized offices, as you can see on the visualization, including an office for military and operations, logistics, law and sanctions or judicial affairs, foreign fighters, and a media office. And all of these different offices, they are very centralized under the leadership of the group. But in addition, and this is more like a side note that I wanted to highlight from the report, is that beyond the replacement and new generations of fighters, there is a very pronounced trend in the increasing use of child soldiers. These are observations that we have seen since back from at least 2016, but it has really become much more explicit and pronounced, as you can see in the group's propaganda and other materials. So there is really a generational shift within the group. And they are indoctrinating very young fighters and kind of embedding this culture of jihad among future generations in the region. And we can move on to the next slide. So after kind of examining this new organizational structure, there is also military zones that are key to understand that these are not just operational theaters or areas of operations, but integral parts of the group's organizational structure. And these zones are largely characterized by being remote, sparsely populated, economically underdeveloped, or with little or no government or military presence. And IS Sahel has divided its area of operations into 5 main military zones, each under the leadership of an emir, who together with a qadi or judge oversees and manages aspects ranging from military operations, community engagement, to judicial matters. And this structure is really in line with this organizational restructuring to a more centralized and bureaucratic system. And this is very kind of evident in the group's activities with the increasing focus on community outreach, self-styled Islamic courts, regular presence at weekly markets, and so on. And another important aspect of ISIL's military organization is the spatial proximity, but also the fluidity between military zones, making them very interconnected. But also, like, the group has historically been characterized by its very high mobility, using swarming tactics with armed assaults in large number of fighters on motorcycles and so forth. So that is really kind of the trademark of IS Sahel as a group: high mobility and the, the extensive use of swarming. And yeah, as I said, there's a lot of overlap, but also that these military zones, they project influence beyond their immediate area. So in both northern and southern direction, these military zones, they exert influence through the violence that the group perpetrates. And as you can see on the picture, these military zones are numbered 1 to 5, ranging from in the west, Burkina Faso and the Gourma of Mali and Niger, and to the border areas between Mali and Niger in the Tawa region in the east. And in the report, there are much more detailed descriptions of these military zones. And we can move on to the next slide. So one interesting component in this report, I believe, is the comparative aspect between ISIL and its jihadi rival JNIM. So Islamic State has faced significant challenges in its regional expansion efforts, which has been very kind of sporadic and opportunistic, but instead the group has been very successful in consolidating its influence and control within its traditional strongholds, but also expanded into nearby areas. But these areas are very proximate. So it is not like they have been successful expanding regionally. However, in Niger specifically, as a country, the group has emerged as the by far dominant armed group, but it is currently facing growing competition from JNIM, although JNIM operates in quite different geographic areas from IS, even though there are some transition zones and so forth. But similarly, JNIM has also acted as a bulwark against further ISIL expansion. And at the same time, it is engaged in a multi-front war of relatively high intensity and also launching attacks with high operational tempo, and outdoes IS Sahel more than threefold in terms of violent activities and related fatalities. And this data is based on observations from the past 3 years between 2022 and 2024. And while JNIM has or comprises the bulwark against ISIL expansion, the group has been very successful in the infighting between them. So most of the battles were actually won by IS, but it hasn't managed to return anyways to areas or key regions like in central Mali and eastern Burkina Faso from where it was driven out in 2020. And similarly, in Benin, where both ISIL and JNIM has claimed operations, IS ambitions have been largely unsuccessful due to the much stronger presence of JNIM and some local inter-jihadi dynamics. And we can show the next slide for comparison, for more comparison between ISIL and JNIM. And one key point is that the relative remoteness of most of ISIL's military zones does that the group doesn't really pose any immediate threat to the regimes in Ouagadougou and Bamako. However, the exception is Niamey, where ISIL has conducted sporadic operations. For instance, a prison break at the Koutoukala High Security Prison, which was very recent, but there were other unsuccessful attempts prior to that. And at the same time, it should also be noted that Niamey is a capital that is under pressure from both IS and JNIM, and they operate in very close vicinity of the capital. And just a few days ago, JNIM attacked a security position in the Seno quarter, which is located within the urban commune of Niamey, as a data point to kind of contextualize this report with some ongoing developments. And as you can see on these maps, JNIM really poses a considerable threat to the political stability of the regimes in Ouagadougou and Bamako. And this kind of reflects the group's potential to encroach on these capital regions, and even more so evidenced by the recent attacks in Bamako and the temporary takeover of the airport. So while ISIL has demonstrated transnational intent, it has far from achieved the same level of regional infiltration as JNIM. And as you might have noticed, JNIM has expanded into West African littoral states, especially in Benin and Togo, and by doing so also outstripping ISIL in both the scope of the geographic reach and the scale of violent activities more broadly throughout the region. And we can move on to the next slide. So last but not least, as ACLED has introduced the conflict exposure tool, we have added some supplemental analysis for this report by analyzing population density data in relation to activities by ISIL to demonstrate the group's impact on civilians. And again, we have added a comparative component by comparison to JNIM. So to begin with, we have some overarching observations and points that by comparing population data and the respective group's area of operations through the event data from ACLED, that we have created sort of hexagon maps that really show the area of operations, and I think they are fairly representative as well. But the highest level of exposure for both groups was in 2020. So we have compared 2020 with the most recent data from up till July 2024. And what we can see is that JNIM has remained stable in terms of activities in all three countries, and the group's violence affects about 40 million people. But ISIL, on the other hand, has experienced quite substantial contraction in both Burkina Faso and Mali, but remains very stable in Niger. And this means that the group affected about 11.5 million people, but this has gone down to 7.5 million. And that corresponds, in the case of JNIM, to about 27,000 villages and towns affected by JNIM violence, and over 8,000 villages and towns affected by ISIL activities. But if we zoom in to focus more on ISIL, we can also get answers to more granular questions, including how population exposure relates to the different military zones of the group, but also, and in this case, I want to highlight a couple of data points, is that ISIL is by far the most active actor in all of its military zones, followed by military forces in all of these different delineated areas. But the exception is Burkina Faso and the Gourma, where ISIL still dominates but faces contestation from JNIM. And another key observation is that the level of violence has persistently increased in all military zones of the group over time. But also that the peripheral military zones, where the largest amount of people is exposed to ISIL violence or the risks of such violence. But it also kind of confirms to some extent that the core military zones centered around Menaka and the Mali-Niger border is remote and is also very sparsely populated and constitute the safe havens where the core leadership has evolved or developed the armed group for nearly a decade. And it's also in these areas where the group primarily has sought to implement its self-styled jihadist governance framework. And last is that when you look at the population exposure data, only 3 million people and less than 3,000 villages fall within these delineated military zones as I've described, but they, as I already said, project influence way further than within these confines. So they are what we can describe as core areas, part of IS Sahel's wider area of operation. But again, both violent and non-violent activities beyond these zones are really something to look at more broadly. And with that, I'm handing over to our external commentator, Ivan Gishau.
Thank you very much, Henny. Ivan?
Thank you so much, Eni, and congratulations on this fantastic work. So I can see already that plenty of questions are coming in the chat, so I will try to keep my comments as short as possible. There are 4 things that I want to say. First of all, I want to emphasize the sort of amazing combination you make of the available data. Like researching a group like the Islamic State is not easy. It's by definition a group that does not disclose its internal secrets. You can observe their behaviors from the outside, but knowing what they do in the inside is very, very difficult. And you do both. You have a perfect knowledge of the behaviors, the things that can be observed from the outside. You know things from the inside as well through a combination and a very creative combination of data that you mobilize. And so methodologically, what you achieve here, I think, is a feat. And it's even more a feat in the sense that you manage to tell a very convincing story based on these different sources that you mobilize. That's my first point. The second point has to do with the approach that you adopt. You go for a chronological approach that compares various dimensions of the behavior of this group. And I think this is the way to go. These groups have been operating in the Sahel for years, and they are not monolithic. They have suffered a lot of military setbacks. They have changed their territorial influence over time. They have changed their policies toward the populations, which means basically that they have constantly changed. And when we study these groups, we should not assume that we are studying the same creature that remains unchanged over time. Of course, these groups have plans, they have goals, they have political objectives, but they also constantly adapt to the context and the setbacks that they suffer, notably from a military perspective. And so what struck me when reading the report, and maybe that's the way I would somehow summarize the takeaway message. I think it's a report about how these groups adapt. And the point is not to say, well, they cannot be defeated or they are like perfectly resilient, but you show an amazing range of different levers that they have to adapt to the changing circumstances. And among these levers, I've identified like how they interact with the policy, the populations, for example. So you said in your presentation that, for example, they've moved from a super violent approach to populations to what you call a consolidation phase, where they adopt reconciliatory measures and try to look nice again, right? That's one way they adapt, but they also adapt through the military techniques that they use. They adapt through the territories and the spatial occupation of the region. They have many. They adapt through the forms of recruitment that they rely on. So you mentioned the case of child soldiering, for example, which is one way to fight attrition. They have many buttons that they can press and that they seem to be using in a very smart way. And they adapt also internally through reorganizing who the commanders are and who is controlling or in charge of which region. So adaptation to me is the key aspect that this report is all about. And you show that the very rich range of aspects that can be changed so that the group eventually survives. Now, I have a series of questions, and you may not necessarily want to answer them because these questions go way beyond the scope of the report itself. But I'm super curious, and I'm sure that some of these questions will be echoed by what people write in the chat. My first question has to do with this sudden change that happened in the behavior of the group from what you call like violence against civilians toward consolidation. So we've all observed this. Now, what is the critical juncture? What is the key driver for this change? That's my first question. And this has been observed particularly in the Menaka region, where the impression was that everybody was asked to leave, and there were, I remember, plenty of questions among analysts about, okay, what is this group calling itself the Islamic State that is kicking out the population from the territory it is controlling? So who do they want to rule if they eventually kick everyone out? So what happened there? What explains this change in behaviors towards civilians? Another question concerns what you call territorial control. So my question is in fact a very concrete one. How does this materialize? Like if you live under or in a territory controlled by the Islamic State, how many times a week do you see them? And how is this control materializing in terms of demands from the group towards the population? Is it through taxation, for example, or do's and don'ts in your daily behavior? That's my second question. I have 7 of them, and it's probably way too long. There's one that is is making me particularly curious. You also show that the group is managing a lot of cultural, linguistic, ethnic diversity in the territories that they control, or that they are or where their influence can be felt. You also show that all these groups are represented among the soldiers. And so is it your understanding that the group has an explicit policy for making room for everyone? And is it managing and fine-tuning the composition of the group to somehow maintain some sort of balance in terms of representation of the different groups from the areas where it is operating? And then I have one last question, which has to do with the reorganization among commanders that you describe. And you also say in the end of the report that there is some tension sometimes between these commanders. And my feeling was perhaps that these tensions were deliberate. Like, does the group have a sort of reward system for the commanders? And if so, what are the objectives that are set for each commander? So is there some competition that is deliberately organized within the group to make each commander in a way stronger and show their skills, their abilities to control or perhaps collect more resources from the population? Is this the sort of incentive structure that prevails within the group? So I will end my talk here. Again, fantastic work, and I invite everyone who has not read the report yet to have a look at it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for great and somewhat challenging questions, but yeah, I'm gonna try to respond to some of them. As for the military offensive in the Menaka region, as you know, it was largely depopulated, or many villages were. But at the same time, taking control of a depopulated area is not a viable, I mean, from a resource perspective, primarily. So, I mean, that was, from what I heard, that they basically ordered people to come back, and yeah, by doing so, they reopen markets and other conciliatory measures to kind of attract people to come back, so they have people to actually rule. And yeah, so that is one thing. But as for the critical juncture, I mean, I really think that is like having resources and people to rule is a kind of prerequisite in order to have a statelet of whatever size. And in terms of like how they manage, you know, cultural differences, in many areas, the kind of the composition of the group reflects the social fabric of the area. But there are also people that can be described as key interlocutors. For instance, you have Yusuf Wuld Shoaib in the Malacca region. He is a very influential Qadi and also kind of involved in other aspects of the group. But he is mixed ethnic. He is half Arab from the house of the Arab Fulan tribe, and on the maternal side is he a Tuareg Shadin Haren. So that means that he has one foot in each community and have been able to kind of bridge some of these kind of issues between, yeah, the communities and the group. So in some cases, there are people that by seniority or other qualities have a lot of confidence from the communities, and they often play the sort of diplomatic role.
Thank you so much to you both. That was very insightful. I'm going to take some leeway as the moderator and ask just a few kind of umbrella questions here before I get started with the many questions that have come in, and they are similar to what we're seeing here, which is that, if I'm not mistaken, Henny, you noted that there has been an increase in the number of fatalities, especially towards civilians within these military zones, but there has been a decrease in the exposure. So that would effectively mean that a smaller group of people are being exposed several times over, rather than a larger group of people kind of seeing, as Yvonne mentioned, seeing them every day or interacting with them on a pretty regular basis. And I would like to know how you think about that as a strategy for IS to both deepen and broaden their influence, if they are maybe refining their role as one where, as we've often thought in the Sahel, they are the largest threat to civilians within that region, rather than being a governance actor, as we would traditionally think.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they are not the most dangerous actor anymore. JNIM they have surpassed them by far, and as I already mentioned, JNIM outdoes ISL threefold in both terms of activities and related fatalities. But after taking over the Menaka region and also expanding into the Gao region, we could observe a quite sharp decline in fatalities. So there was the data clearly showed the decrease in violence. I mean, the area was, first of all, quite depopulated, but since they took control of the area, they also started to change in how they interacted for the reasons we already mentioned. But at the same time, it has become a little bit, how should you say, complicated, because when an insurgent group take control of an area, they also control the information flow. So I suspect that there is a lot of things happening around Menaka that goes unreported. So this is something that we also saw in the area of Juwaru, or in parts of more remote parts of Mopti, where JNIM really consolidated their influence, and the reporting has stopped, like nothing happened in that area. And there is a similar trend, I believe, in these areas where the control is more pronounced. And to come back to Ivan's question about control, it is obviously a rubber band word with a broad spectrum, very fluid and so forth. But yeah, strong influence and control is something that I can use interchangeably without having sleep issues at night.
Thanks. I also wanted to just note about these military zones. I find that really fascinating, the five that you've outlined, and whether or not the activities in any one of those zones you would say are a precursor or the model for how they are going to move forward. And so what should we expect from this group as it, as Yvonne mentions, adapts to the new environment, especially one in which JNIM has clearly become the dominant actor? So is there activity in any one of those five zones that you would say this is going to be one of the most pronounced patterns into the future, continuing how they operated in any one of those?
I mean, for the core areas, they have been quite unchanged over time. You have the core leadership moving around in these kind of in the hinterland of Menaka. While in Burkina Faso, it is a more densely populated area, but the group is quite cornered in the extreme north of the country. But the military zone that I'm, as an observer, most concerned about is the Tawa area, because it has engaged in extreme violence in this area, but it's also the fact that it has transformed a long-serving supply corridor into a major support zone, which is also very important for resource extraction. And at the same time, they have expanded into northwestern Nigeria, where they don't, as far as I'm aware, engage in violence, but they are very present and they use these areas as a form of rear base. And rear bases can often be transformed into combat zones. I mean, depending on responses from the state or, other drivers of violence, like intercommunal violence or whatever. But yeah, that's military zone 5 and Tawa and kind of connected support zone is the geographic area that I'm most concerned about and where I believe it can continue to expand. And we have already seen signs of that, as we've kind of outlined in the future or the looking forward section in the report. So they have made some gains and tried to expand into other areas in that part of this kind of area of operations.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So there's a few questions here that kind of revolve around similar issues. One is, of course, the differences, the meaningful differences between JNIM and ISGS. And in particular, you've spoken a little bit about the composition of the groups, but perhaps are there ideological differences? Are there end goal differences? Are there financing differences? And along with that, how is IS funding itself, financing itself to engage in this continued activity given the level of competition from JNIM?
So both groups are, to begin with, very self-sustained when it comes to resourcing. So they have cattle rustling, they engage in artisanal mining, they collect very different types of taxes, including zakat or Islamic alms or taxes, but also other forms of extortion. So they have multiple and very diverse revenue streams from where they finance their operations. And I'm going to take an example that I probably mentioned before, but in March or in February 2022, before they launched a major offensive, they roamed around in villages in this support zone that I already described, and they collected something close to $100,000 in just a few days by extorting a few villages in the Doso region. And I mean, to get your hands on $100K just weeks prior to launching an offensive, that could be a little bit of a game changer as well in terms of resources, especially when you see how things played out just a month later.
Great, thank you very much. So they're not using kidnapping or anything else to sustain
Yeah, they
their...
do. They frequently use kidnap for ransom as well.
Okay, excellent.
Including in areas that they actually control. So they are kind of somewhat arbitrarily or selectively, yeah, they choose their victims for payment of ransom.
Okay, so given that, I wonder if you can speak just a little bit to the real or potential differences between the end goals of these particular agents that are competing. separate, of course, to what the governments may want for these respective countries. What would you say differentiates the end goals of JNIM and ISGS?
I mean, the prosaic goal to create an Islamic state is the same, but the approach to how to achieve that goal is different. So JNIM's approach is more gradual. You see that also that they don't harshly implement like Sharia law in the same way as IS Sahel does. They are very brutal in the way they do it. They use stonings, they use mutilations for thieves, and they do it openly, and they also showcase it in their propaganda. JNIM do the same things at times, but they do it much more discreetly at a very discreet local level, and they don't, boost about it in their media operations. So
Excellent.
there are very kind of distinct ideological differences between the two groups, even though they follow the same more broader Salafi jihadi ideology.
Thanks. That's very helpful. So I'm going to come back to something that Yvonne mentioned, and also some people have been asking about, which is the structure, what you started with, the structure of these groups, and what the benefits of centralization, or as we were saying before, these kind of more diffuse method of organization would bring for the group. And then what reward system is seemingly operational within to prevent, for example, internecine fighting within the powerful players at different command levels. So how are they able to ensure a level of organizational coherence and alignment, given what the group has previously tried to do?
Yeah, that's a quite tricky question. I mean, to bridge the factionalism, I don't really have the insights to describe how that is done through their own inner makings. But one thing that I think is pretty clear is that a set of very senior commanders, they have kind of centralized the control of the group. I mean, that's a trend that has been ongoing since the creation of the group. Like with Adnan Abu Walid al-Sahrawi, he was a quite strong leader. And similarly, we have seen the same kind of dynamics in various parts where local emirs have come to prominence and become very influential. And that has created this factionalism. But also, like Ivan said, that sometimes it can appear to be a little bit too deliberate. Like, yeah, you have a couple of fighters stealing some livestock, but all of a sudden they gonna get mutilated for doing that because the owner of the actual livestock was some influential person that actually supported the group, but supported maybe those who are part of the more core leadership and not this local subgroup. So yeah, you have those dynamics as well within the organization, and how they bridge that, it's not always clear, but they do engage in more broader military campaigns. They do coordinate attacks between different subgroups. So that's also creates a sort of, a common sort of goal or objectives.
I'm sure IS could come up with a very interesting management training manual for people. So the other questions I have, and some have related to here, is about, you mentioned that there was some incursions into northwest Nigeria. This is also an area that is absolutely covered in different militias that are both active and kind of embedded within that space. And I'm wondering if they're having success given the level of kind of competition that they may face for territorial embeddedness there, or if they're finding ways to align themselves with these militias, and how might they do that? What is the attraction to align?
So this is super interesting because this touches upon an issue that I think everyone that is watching the Sahel and also trying to understand the links to Nigeria kind of find themselves completely lost on. Because we can often follow what these groups do until they reach the Nigerian border. But when when they have crossed that border, it becomes pitch black and no more information is available. So that is an issue, kind of bridging the gap, whether it's intelligence, information, or whatever, across those borders, because they have become, these different theaters, if you like, have become so compartmentalized. And yeah, following those traces are very difficult. So we really don't know what they do more explicitly inside of Nigeria, but we know that they use it as rest place for recruitment, resources, and more. And apparently quite undisturbed.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Of course, a really big focus of a lot of attention in the region has been the incursion of Wagner, or now Africa Corps. Can you please summarize for us what their relationship is with this group, how they're engaging with the group, and whether or not Africa Corps is believed, up until, of course, very recently, to be successful or not as a strategy to deal with these groups?
Both yes and no. I mean, overall, more broadly, I think Wagner has really not filled the gap left behind by the French forces and other Western partners, including the UN peacekeeping mission. But at the same time, there are nuances. They have put pressure on some subgroups, especially in military zone 2, that we call the Hausa area, where both the Mona armed forces and Wagner mercenaries are much more present. So that group has even triggered defections, people surrendering, and that has created suspicion within the group. So this subgroup, they are more prone to defections, surrenders, and so forth, and have become targeted for that reason. Although things seem to have calmed down a little bit now, but yeah, that's something that we've seen. And Wagner has not prevented IS from expanding throughout the Menaka and Gao region, which they have done, but they have likely prevented the group from capturing Menaka town, because they have attacked Menaka at least 4 times since late 2023. And I think Wagner personnel played a quite key role in repelling those armed attacks.
Right. Thank you very much.
And just like an additional note is that also that some local groups have also defected in larger numbers when Wagner arrived. So there was a specific tribe or sub-faction, a Tuareg sub-faction, that was aligned with Islamic State, but they eventually switched and became guides and informants and so forth. So there is a mixed bag of success and failure when it comes to Wagner.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to get back to something that I thought was really fascinating that Yvonne mentioned, which is the daily experience of somebody living within any one of these zones, or those, for example, who are dealing with both JNIM and ISGS. But the dailiness of a person, a citizen, I mean, somebody in the questions asked about the Christian minority, for example, and how much they are experiencing more or less attention by these groups. And then what the dailiness of the fighters is themselves as a distinct community, and whether or not there is information about how these groups, for example, want to engage with humanitarian actors or local governance or police or any of the structures or the institutional structures that are present at a local level.
So I can give my 2 cents to some of this. So there is an understanding that IS Sahel, they are not as easy to engage for humanitarian actors, but they still do. What I would say is that they probably are a little bit more unpredictable than JNIM, or even much more unpredictable. So they can do things that are unexpected and can turn really bad. So let's say a humanitarian is working in an area, he is accepted to be there, but all of a sudden he can be abducted and end up in a photo series being executed just for the sake of producing some quality propaganda.
Great. And
That is probably the differences in, at least for humanitarian actors
then for
engaging two groups.
police or local government?
They have targeted the local officials incessantly, but of course there are always exceptions and people who can, maintain some form of social safety even under jihadi rule.
Okay,
But
excellent.
we can touch on the subject of Christians. So that is, it's not like they systematically attack and kill Christians, but they use that as well for similar kind of propaganda purposes. Like we captured 5 Christians. Often they are not Malians. They are like workers coming from, let's say, Benin or Ghana, crossing through the main transit route from Niamey to Gao, and they get selected on a bus or something and then removed and executed, and often for propaganda purposes.
Okay, thank you very much. My last question is a little bit tricky, I suppose, and it relates to, of course, the recent attacks in Bamako and the way in which the central or the Malian government is not responding or not reacting to it very publicly. I'm wondering what you think might be the next shift in this region to signal that either the governments have tried a new tactic to deal with this growing threat, or is there going to be a continuation of this largely unsuccessful engagement through Wagner and others?
I mean, the short answer, I believe, is that we will see a continuation and like the same escalation ladder, I mean, in the coming year, because there are no signs of appeasement or anything like that.
Okay. I actually want to give Ivan a moment to respond or to summarize some thoughts before we sign off.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I was listening with to what Amy was saying. He's definitely the expert. Like he's the person we go to ask the tricky questions that were asked today. So I'm not sure I have anything much to add, but perhaps your very last question about like the overall security dynamic and what the governments are presently doing. So we're in a situation now where the UN peacekeeping mission has been kicked out of Mali. The French have been kicked out. These 3 countries of the Central Sahel have tried to establish their own solutions to the security situation. They have invited the Russians. Now the Russians are reconfiguring a little bit their military presence. So the landscape keeps shifting. But what the data shows, what the report shows, what also the daily observation of the political dynamics and the security dynamic show is that the situation is not really improving. And then when it comes to the specific issue of the protection of civilians, we actually see a deterioration of the situation. And what I found like very, very interesting is talking about adaptation, the very heavy-handed approach that the governments are now using, and the report talks about the use of drone strikes, and we never know really like who are on the receiving ends of these strikes, but there's a high likelihood that many civilians are in fact victims of these drone strikes. Yeah, these changes in the doctrine of warfare by the governments have not changed the security dynamics and the expansion of these groups. So we now are reaching the end of a decade where many different solutions have been proposed, and strictly nothing has dramatically improve the situation. So it's a fairly bleak landscape and perspective that we are contemplating right now. And I will definitely agree with Amy to say that the coming months are probably going to look like more of the same, with no real end in sight.
Thank you very much for those insights. Henny, I'm going to close out now and thank everybody for their patience and also their excellent questions. But I'd like to give the last word to you and, of course, direct people to your excellent report if they would like to learn more about your recent work.
I mean, thank you all for listening. It was great to be here, and for having Ivan and Euclid as moderators and commentators is great. So thank you very much, everyone.
It's been a great pleasure, of course, to link up with Yvonne again and also to hear more about this report. I encourage everybody to read the report and also to return for other webinars we have on different regions. And this webinar will be posted so you can watch it later if you wish. With that, thank you very much, everybody.